Okay, welcome back to another episode of Present Truth from Camp to Mead. And again, we've got Tom Stapleton with us, visiting from Missouri online. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Thank you for having me again. This is great.
Yeah, this is exciting. And just so you know, everyone knows, it's getting close to Passover time, and there's been some questions coming up about Passover. And so that's actually been what's on our minds. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. The title is Passover for Believers in Yeshua. It's worded that way for a reason. It's really important. And we have three questions for Tom. First one is the Passover to be kept today? So what do you think, Tom? Is the Passover something we should be doing today?
Well, actually, I want to get all your questions first so I can get my mind straight around what you're going to ask.
Okay, the second one is, if so, where do we keep it? And also, if so, do we have to sacrifice a lamb? These are what we're dealing with today.
Yeah, those are fair questions, certainly today. Is the Passover to be kept today? That was your first question?
Yes.
Okay. You know, there's a lot of question. I talk to Christians that don't believe you should have to keep any of the law. Some of them just some of the law. Some of them just the Sabbath. Others now are coming to a knowledge of keeping the feasts and partially the Torah and so on. So there's all different degrees of what people are learning. And what I encourage people to learn to do is just keep studying, because God will lead them and guide them into all truth. We know that for sure. But where I'm at today is that the Passover is actually one of God's signs that he gave his people many, many years ago. And even after Yeshua had died and was raised and went back to heaven, the believers still kept the Passover. And when we understand the meaning of the Passover and the transition that happened, absolutely, yes, I do believe we should still be keeping the Passover. And that's becoming evident with many, many people. So, you know, how can I prove that? That's a whole nother study in itself. So is it suffice to say that, yes, we should be keeping the Passover and we move on, or are you looking for some proof about that?
Well, typically the people that we're talking to these days are pro Passover, so I don't think that's going to be too difficult of a sell. I think we can get there pretty easily. But what we've been dealing with more is the how do we keep it, sort of where and those things, and the sacrificial part of it. That would be sort of the focus for this video. Okay, so your second question was, if so, where do we keep the Passover? Right,
okay. So we need some Bible examples. We want to start with the Bible, and I think we can very easily if we go to Acts chapter 20, I believe it is. Let's just turn to Acts chapter 20 and read it for ourselves and see what it says. Luke records in Acts chapter 20, verse 6, it says, "But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread." And of course, the Passover is connected to the days of unleavened bread. And it says, right, in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. So this is indicating to me, this is many years. This is like 20, could be 20 plus years after the death of Yeshua. Luke records that they stayed in Philippi until the Passover was over. And I have to ask the question, what were they doing? To me, it's pretty obvious. They wanted to keep the Passover in Philippi. They were keeping it in Philippi. Now, here's where something very interesting comes up, because Paul in another place tells us that he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees of the tribe of Benjamin, so on, so forth. And we know that he probably had the whole Torah memorized. He knew exactly what it said. And at this point in his life, I would have to say he understood what the Torah meant. and its obligations. Now, to a Jew, and the reason why Jews do not sacrifice today, it is my understanding, because they do not have a temple. If they had a temple, they would be going to Jerusalem just as they were called to do at the time of Yeshua. At the time, they all from all nations. They had to go to 3 feasts: the Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Now,
right, but you just said, sorry to cut you off, but you just said that this happened 20, 30 years after Yeshua. The temple was still around.
Exactly. We can't miss that point. So Paul, at the time the temple was in full operation, sacrificing lambs. They would have been doing the Passover, sacrificing Passover lambs. Everyone would have brought their lamb. But Paul here is in Philippi. That's a problem for a Pharisee. And so I suggest something had changed. Now, Yeshua, in talking to the woman at the well, said that there's the day coming when they will no longer worship the Father or on this mountain, but they will worship in spirit and truth. So Yeshua was talking of a time when the gospel would go to all the world. And it looks to me like the feast, by this little example here, it looks to me like the feasts are part of the gospel. Now, when the gospel went to the world, it was not mandatory from here on in to go back to Jerusalem to sacrifice for Passover. And this is by Paul's actions, Paul and Luke's actions. They are not going to Jerusalem for Passover. So it appears to me that they kept the Passover at Philippi. Now that tells me that I can keep the Passover wherever I am in this world. Because in Corinth admonishes the believers, Christ our Passover, in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7 and 8. He says, Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us, therefore let us keep the feast. So he was even talking to the Corinthians, so I suspect that the Corinthians would have been keeping it at Corinth. So wherever he set up churches, they would keep the Passover wherever they were. They were not traveling to Jerusalem.
Okay. But that leads directly into the third question, because now we've got kind of an issue. Either they were sacrificing lambs outside of the temple grounds in Corinth and in Philippi, like you're saying. Like if they were doing that, then they weren't doing it at the temple where it was supposed to happen by the priests. So right. Third question, what about this lamb sacrifice?
Exactly. Now let's just think about this for a second. Those people that were Jews of the house of Israel, they were to go to Jerusalem because God had said that you will not sacrifice outside of where I have placed my name. So they would have went to Jerusalem. Those people that were not believers in Yeshua would go to Jerusalem and sacrifice their lambs, their Passover lambs. But the believers in Yeshua did not go to Jerusalem to sacrifice their Passover lamb because their Passover lamb was Yeshua. Nowhere in the Torah does it allow you to have 2 Passover lambs. So either Yeshua is our Passover lamb or he is not. And Paul says that, and let's read, let's go to the text so we don't misquote here. Paul says,
where are you going?
1 Corinthians 5. 1 Corinthians 5. It's interesting to note that 1 Corinthians was written just before Passover, and he's giving 3 times he hits on the Passover in the book of 1 Corinthians. So we know that it was just for the Passover, and he's telling them how to celebrate it. He goes in verse 7, verse 5, chapter 5, verse 7. He says, "Therefore purge out the old leaven." He even brings the symbolic meaning of it, "that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed, Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast. not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice or wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So to me, that's it. I mean, I hate to have a one text prove all, but they were only allowed to have one Passover. So when Yeshua came, all the Passover lambs that have been sacrificed before that were pointing to him. They were the shadow of what he was to come and do. When he came and died, he took away the symbol or the shadow because reality had met. We had met reality head on, and all of those shadows that were pointing forward to him. This is why Paul says Christ is our Passover. We need not, number one, we don't need to go to Jerusalem. Even if there was a temple, the writer of Hebrews tells us that while there was a temple operating in Jerusalem, in chapter 13, and I want to challenge the listeners to read carefully Hebrews chapter 13. While there was a temple operating in full operation, priests and everything, Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, I believe to be Paul, was saying, do not go. Those people that serve at that temple are not even worthy to sit and eat with us. And it was because they rejected Yeshua, because they continued to sacrifice those things that were to point forward to him. So my personal belief is, if someone was to take a lamb and slay it, they may not understand what they're doing, but they're actually technically rejecting the provision that God has made for their salvation.
That totally makes sense, because it says that for the believers. And so for someone that believes in Yeshua, it isn't believing in him as the sacrifice for our sins part of believing in him?
Well, John said, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. It's my sin that's going to keep me out of the kingdom. I need my sin dealt with. And my lamb is Yeshua, not a four-legged animal. It's Yeshua.
Yeah. Okay, well, that clarifies it for me for sure. So if you have any other questions, comment below or email the ministry. Go to the website, endtimesprophecy.com, and you can contact us by there. Also, you've been doing some other interviews, and I just want to mention that right now on Now You See TV. So if you want to see more of Tom Stapleton on very recent stuff in the last month, you can Google Tom Stapleton. And if you don't find it there, look for Now You See TV, and you'll see the episodes on there. Really, really great stuff that's been going on that way. So thank you for joining us again, Tom. And thank you for this wonderful explanation of these three questions. Talk to you soon.
Thanks again, Alan.